you're feeling like you're not confident in this or that you feel discouraged, that's actually not a sign of inevitable failure. That's actually a sign of growth, and you should just keep on going.
Thank you so much, Josh and Martin, for joining us on 3 Points. We are so excited to have this time together to explore some of the research that you've been putting together around what makes an effective founder. And I certainly haven't had the chance to partner with both of you during my time at Google and now with People Playbook to do some work with Google for Startups. The thing that I always hear from founders is, gosh, I wish I had this sooner. I wish I had this earlier in my startup journey, because they jump into a position where, they've got 100 plus employees and they're managing teams, but they started off building a product, right?
Yeah, we find this stuff is always swept under the rug until it's often too late, and then it can become the reason that startups fail, which was a data point that we didn't derive, but 65% of startups fail due to people problems.
Wow.
And it's usually because it's not the item of the day. It always seems like something that can wait for tomorrow or next month, and things fester, and then ultimately it breaks down. And so you end up with founders often wishing they could turn back the time and have revisited these things earlier and address them more holistically. And so that's something that we are trying to help folks do is see a little bit ahead and do that. And so we've definitely seen that this is a problem that we're hoping to kind of keep helping out on.
There's nothing like, we've just launched our beta, or we've just raised a round of funding, or we've just hired our 100th employee. Like, all of these things are super Instagrammable, very tweetable, very kind of like you want to just broadcast that to the world. No one will broadcast, we thought deeply about the people side of our business and we're really trying to nail it. Like, there's something that's so unglamorous but so foundational about that. That's not rocket science, which is a pretty ironic thing, because we're so good at rocket science as a civilization. We're not great at, predicting people's behavior and being excellent at collaboration and anticipating conflict among founders. So our work hopes to make it a lot easier for founders to do the hard but fundamental thing.
Yeah, I love that. Lots of interesting insights. I think 7 in its entirety in terms of leadership strategies or capabilities that stuck out. But there are 3 that you two have found that really kind of surprised you. And I'd like to start off with the first one, which was this idea of treating people like volunteers.
Yeah. Well, maybe I can quickly start by saying I was pretty disappointed to see that this was by far the most predictive capability of founder effectiveness.
You were disappointed?
I was disappointed because the world doesn't need to know that having a really compelling vision and treating people well is the right formula for success. I feel like I was hoping to find something more counterintuitive. And so in that moment of disappointment, I was like, okay, surely if we disaggregate this number and we look at the differences between Silicon Valley or developed markets and emerging markets, or if we looked at what we call in the study engineering dominant verticals, I was hoping to see that it actually didn't hold true for those non-Silicon Valley, non-engineering dominant verticals. Unfortunately, the effect is even greater with those groups. And so it's a pretty robust idea. Now, so what is it? This is actually Peter Drucker talks about how, the reason why nonprofits are a brilliant place to learn leadership is because you don't have a salary to hold people to your expectations of them. The only thing you have is a really meaningful and, mind you, a really difficult goal. And the most effective founders in our data set don't shy away from talking about how difficult and yet meaningful achieving that goal is. When they're able to do that, a few things happen. One is the best engineer that comes out of that graduating class, they want to work on difficult problems. Competitors are not going to come into that space because, it looks too difficult to actually do. And then you create this virtuous cycle of creating this talent monopoly where you're able to attract the best people. You're able to attract funding because you're one of the few players in that space. And it's just a brilliant formula for success.
Yeah, it was interesting for me as well. I come from nonprofit world. That was where I spent the first chapter of my career, and I still, serve on the board.
I was going to say, you're still in the nonprofit world doing stuff there, Josh.
Yeah, I still am. Yeah, I'm on the board of two that I co-founded, and then kind of have been just in an advisory capacity. But I've been now working at Google for almost 8 years, and then supporting startups in different capacities. And I think that was a big surprise and interesting for me to see the transfer of that sort of need. When you're in a nonprofit world, like Martin said, that's all you have is inspiring people through the mission. You're not going to retain them through any equity that doesn't exist. Nothing like this makes any sense. And so you think, once you get to a startup, this should really, the money should speak for itself, and you can keep people that way. And when you at the end of the day, it's a more of a perk than the most important retention factor, motivating factor. So. Yeah, for me, it was surprising in that sense. I don't know if I fully expected that sort of nonprofit mission-based angle to be as foundational and important as it turns out to be.
That must have been fun for you, though, Josh, when Martin was surprised and you were like, no, it makes sense.
The social scientist in me was hoping to find something more novel. But I mean, it's an important message to founders, right? Like, just because you have offered equity and just because you pay a salary, it doesn't excuse bad behavior. You must remember that good people have options. They can walk away, and they will, if you don't point their energy and their time towards things that feel personally meaningful to them.
I love this idea of attracting talent, based on your mission and inspiring people to join your startup. That seems like a no-brainer for a founder. Now, what happens when they join? How do we continue as leaders of startups, as founders, to, continue down the path of treating people like volunteers and really leaning in? What sort of actions can they take?
Yeah, no, that's a good one. So one big word of caution we put out in that section of the report is almost to the effect of, founders, if your gut tells you that I must now go to my team and give them an inspirational speech, the research actually shows that that's probably a bad idea. There's some really cool research by Adam Grant, who's a prolific author and professor at Wharton, where he looks into this, where he runs an experiment with people who are raising funds for scholars, and he created 2 conditions. So the first condition was the manager came to give a 5-minute pep talk. And then in the second condition, he asked one of the scholars that benefited from the fundraising of this team just come and for 5 minutes, just give a very simple thank you and kind of how their work has helped transform their lives. And he found that in the first scenario, when the manager was giving the pep talk, there was no change in their level of effort and persistence. In fact, in some pockets, there was a reduction in it because there was almost this sense of like, oh yeah, the boss is saying this because they want us to work harder. Like, I'm a little bit suspicious, there's some distrust. But in the second treatment group, it was a much significant, something to the effect of like 170% increase in effort and persistence. So you want to think about how to outsource inspiration. You don't want to do it yourself. You want to create a line of sight between the work that junior engineer who's debugging your code, create a line of sight to what they're doing with what actually is impacting the users. So that's the first one. The second quick one, and I'll have Josh jump in here. The second one is, it's so important to understand why people are actually there to work in your startup. And in our experience, it tends to be one of 3 things. And so this is the shorthand we use when we talk to founders. You just have to think about head, heart, and wallet. The head is people come to the startup because they are so attracted by such a difficult problem to solve, and they want to create a really elegant tech solution, solve for it. The heart is, I am so deeply committed to a specific user group, and this work allows me to create impact with this specific group. And then the wallet is, whether it's financial rewards or this idea of like a social or a psychological wallet, which is, well, it allows me to affiliate with this tribe that I have now found, or it gives me a title that I'm able to, carry with pride. And you want to understand, in your team, like who's motivated by what, and you want to be able to angle the work and position the work that they need to do that allows them to see that it actually meets those personal goals that they have.
One, I'll kind of bring up something connected, maybe a little bit new, and then to reinforce Martin's first point on like connecting to customer or sort of end user or whatever, where you see the value really touching the market or whatever. So the first one is, and it might be somewhat obvious, but is like a meaningful mission statement of sorts. Like what is a simple, sort of steady, consistent statement that can rally the team, and when you're hiring it's something that everybody can understand and can connect the work to, again, the end impact, the inspiring impact. And that's something that you can always come back to. Right now I'm chief of staff within Google Brain team, and we have make machines intelligent, improve people's lives, and it's a huge reason people join here is that they feel I'm not just here to advance Google's products. If I am doing so, it's because I see the bigger picture, and a lot of this research is around making the world a better place, and our researchers are highly motivated by that. And I think if our mission statement was something different, we would have a much harder time recruiting folks and motivating them, and I think it's really important. And with the nonprofits I've been in, that's extremely important to me, is that the sort of North Star statement, it feels right and it's meaningful. I'm somebody who values those. You don't want to get lost into sort of mission statement world forever or something. I don't want to overvalue it either, but I think being thoughtful about that mission statement and connecting the dot between work and impact is really valuable. And then to Martin's first point, which I totally agree with, hearing directly from those impacted is extremely valuable. We had a healthcare startup in Brazil called Portal Telemedicina. It's one of our top performing founders. The data shows this too, and they were excellent at showcasing stories and even hearing directly from people's lives who were saved in far off villages who never would have gotten the health care and the time that they needed. Lives were saved due to the technology, and all these stories, and even the people came back into the team to share, and the founder was very proactive at making sure that those loops came full circle, right? You didn't ship the tech and then just keep working. Like you saw exactly, and it saw how it folded back into you, and that is highly motivating, right? And again, you go back, this is somebody who's building a team, disrupting this whole industry in a market like Brazil. Again, we go back to the difficulties of maybe exiting and getting a liquidation event, but still able to bring in top talent and motivating, because they're really changing the world and saving lives, and everybody realizes it because they see it firsthand. So yeah, all that stuff is important.
I just continue to find this message of seeing the fruits of thy labor ultimately, and seeing the impact of your work is just so important. I'm thinking even when we're a very small business, but when David joined, and he loves a spreadsheet. He absolutely loves a spreadsheet. There's no question about it. He manages our operations. He does a lot of stuff in the office. And I remember when I was first, as we left kind of the pandemic back when, and we started moving out of lockdown, he wanted to come and see the work, and it was something I had never really thought about. I was like, of course, come and see it, but it just lit him up because he understood the impact of what he was doing in the office and actually the work that we're trying to do. So I love hearing stories like that, and definitely I know Josh from the nonprofit, Martin, I know you've done work with nonprofits, so it's a good lesson from that field. So what I'd love to do now is I want to pivot into our second point, and our second point, which you find maybe again a little bit surprising from the study, which is, and I can't wait to get into this, invite disagreement.
I'm chuckling because I think we debated a lot about this word disagreement, because I think when people think disagreement, they think disagreeable, which I think that just that distinction alone captures a bit of the zeitgeist of what people think about when they think about disagreement. So in our report, when we ask co-founders and employees, kind of how important is it to invite disagreement? About 42% would say pretty important to be an effective leader. When we turn to the founders themselves and we ask, okay, well, how important is it to invite disagreement? 3%. 3% think it's important. And so then you want to ask the question, well, why the gap, right? I think on one end, you might say, well, there's a gap because founders maybe don't truly value disagreement, which is one way to think about it. Another way to think about it is, I think the founders assume that people will raise their opinions, even if whether or not they invite it. And I think the message of this point is that effective founders are very systematic in creating the conditions where people can disagree with them, where debate is a big part of the everyday, the day-to-day. And the important distinction we want to draw here is that, you want to have the most effective teams we've seen have a lot of conflict, but it's conflict of ideas and not conflict of personalities. You want to give people that, that environment where they can disagree. There's a really interesting story of this guy, Bob Taylor, in the early days of the internet. So he was one of the earliest technologists who worked on the first versions of the internet, and also was in Xerox Spark, where they built the very first personal computer. Okay, so he builds like this dream team of technologists to work on this project. And, when he's asked, what were some of the things that you did as the manager of that team that actually created just the most brilliant innovations that the world today, that everyone in the world pretty much uses? He talks about the difference between a class 1 and a class 2 disagreement, which I love. So he talks about how a class 1 disagreement is when, Tony, you and I disagree, but I cannot explain back to you your point to my satisfaction. Another way to think about this is I will debate you on a straw man, which is, let me construct your argument in the weakest way possible and then attack it, and obviously you will win, right? A class 2 disagreement is that I'm able to explain back to you your point in a way that is satisfactory to you and that even strengthens your point. And then I can go about and disagree with that point. And he was saying that his only role in that team was to move class 1 disagreements into class 2 disagreements. It wasn't to resolve the disagreement. It was simply to create an environment where people were listening deeply enough that they can truly understand the point that's being made, and then and only then, go about disagreeing.
I have to ask, Martin, what's the one thing we could do in order to move those disagreements into the class 2? I've put you on the spot now. Let's call Bob and ask him.
Let's
you
call
get a
him.
phone a friend.
So what you want to do is you want to move from straw man arguments to what some people have called steel man arguments, which is, before you disagree, tell me what you heard. But tell me what you heard in a way that gives the other person the benefit of the doubt, that puts the other person in a great light. It's very common for us to think about someone's opinion that you disagree with and think, surely they're just not thinking straight, or what are they smoking? Surely there's, they're not thinking, or they're not looking at the data the correct way. And so you want to suspend that judgment and invite people to just read back, share back what they heard.
Yeah, there's a bit about it. What I'm picking up from what you're saying, Martin, is there's also a bit about, staying curious longer, right? I can't remember who talked about it, but yes, really being curious and trying to understand first before jumping in and attacking the straw man, it sounds like. Okay.
Yeah. One thing I'll add to it is I feel like, interestingly, like the workshop that we've led so many times, that this is sort of at the center of it all, is getting to a place that invites vulnerability and allows a team to come together and discuss sensitive issues that have been hiding under the surface, and bring those to light. And we've seen so many times how much this can transform a team. and bring back a level of sort of freshness and camaraderie that might have been lacking for some time. So, we've seen firsthand now, how do you do that safely? This is what we were just discussing, ways that you can do that. But certainly, if you block a space for having sensitive discussions in your team, you're not inviting disagreement. What'll happen is, over time, those disagreements, you end up with a team that drifts further and further apart, and you polarize, and then this is kind of the ticking time bomb of what will ultimately fail a startup, right? Is this inability to discuss these sorts of matters. So one thing that we have in the workshop is the co-founder user guide is an interesting example, where Martin mentioned head, heart, and wallet, but ultimately each sort of co-founder, it could be sort of team member, thinking down about themselves, putting down a lot about how they like to work with others, what motivates them, all these things, and then learning about each other, and then kind of reframing how you work together. And sometimes in that process, a lot of sensitive things come up, of things that have been points of disagreement or misalignment, and you're able to kind of work through them. But again, if you had an environment that didn't allow or enable these kind of things, and you again were sort of preventing these vulnerable or more sensitive discussions, you never overcome these gaps. And again, it can be maybe a leading contributor to failure.
Yeah, I love the founder's user guide, and I think about this environment and this relationship and dynamic between founder and employees, for example. And I think you think of your own experience with your manager. I mean, how confident and comfortable are people generally to disagree without being invited? I mean, it's I think that those people are few and far between, right? And Martin, you joked about kind of these Instagram moments and things, but the sort of faithful, consistent practice for leaders to be able to create that space, day in, day out. I really like that as kind of a focus point in order to kind of live up to this important finding. So far we've talked about treating people like volunteers. Our second point was all around inviting disagreement, and our third and final point is how to overcome discouragement and how important that is.
So let me tell you why I personally think this is maybe the most important insight from this report. So at some point in doing this work, we were starting to do work with, more successful, bigger startups, some of them at the unicorn billion-dollar valuation stage, some even in the decacorn, the kind of tens of billions of dollars stage. And it was fairly clear to me that at that point, with so much success, there really wasn't much more we could do to help these groups. And I remember distinctly, in Singapore, we had one of the early, hottest startups that achieved unicorn status in that region. We had them over for a 2-3 day workshop, and the founder was such a sponge, and he was just asking so many questions. And so at the end of that whole session, I say something to the effect of, I am personally surprised at the kind of, humility and willingness to learn that you've brought to this workshop. And then the founder responds, and it was seared in my memory. He said, "Martin, we are no longer seed stage startup founders. We know we need the help." And I thought, what a strange thing to say, because you would expect almost the opposite, right? That the seed stage startups probably know that they need the help, and then the ones who've succeeded don't really need the help. And so I thought, okay, well, I wonder if the data bears this out. We saw almost literally the opposite in our data set, which is the least effective founders were the most confident, whereas the most effective founders were the least confident.
That's pretty scary, actually.
Well, it's scary because it tells you so much about, I guess, the human condition, right? In some way, you need to be overconfident to even get started on that startup journey. So it's actually a very useful thing as a human species that we are overconfident when we know nothing. But what tends to happen is when we realize just what it takes to be successful, we realize, oh, okay, I don't know if I can do that, or I don't know that I can do that well. And apparently this has been studied, right? This isn't unique to our data set. There are these two psychologists. I think at that time they were in Cornell University, named Dunning and Kruger. And they came up with this thing called the Dunning-Kruger effect, which is essentially the same finding, which is you're most confident when you are least competent. And that goes down as you increase your level of skill. And then over time, it actually increases. Like you actually become more confident at some point, but you never reach the same level of confidence than when you knew nothing. So there's almost this like irony of confidence. And part of why we find this to be the most revelatory and maybe the most useful, I would imagine, point in the study, because a lot of founders find themselves in these startup ecosystems where everyone seems to be just crushing it, right? Everyone's expanding to new markets, raising more funding, hiring more people, their user base is increasing. And a lot of these founders go home at night thinking, oh, wow, like I'm probably the worst at this of all these peers. The stats will show the opposite, right? Like most of those founders are going to fail, but it seems like they're all succeeding. And so what might be happening? It's that we've created some kind of a brag culture in the startup world, and the downstream effect on the individual founders' kind of sense of can I even do this and keep on going is hurt tremendously. And so we help founders realize that, hey, if you're feeling like you're not confident in this or that you feel discouraged, hey, that's actually not a sign of inevitable failure. That's actually a sign of growth, and you should just keep on going.
Yeah, to Martin's point, I think, this is an extremely important revelation that the data is able to help back up, and it does layer onto some other studies like the Dunning-Kruger. But there is this sort of valley of low confidence, and again, like you have these sort of eye-wide, bushy-tailed sort of early-stage founders coming in with a little bit of ignorance, but overdose of confidence. And then, when we were often working with these sort of growth stage startups at the A, B stage, and this is when, they were a little bit taken aback and realizing they had a lot of gaps, especially I talked about earlier with leadership angles and things. But knowing when to kind of call for help and when to dig in for the long fight is important, and having the ability to, again, like something I love about the work we're doing is this isn't just a story of one person. Again, like a lot of sort of startup leadership stories are sort of like the hero who's sort of exited multiple times, and it becomes somebody you look at like a superhuman that, like, am I that? And if I'm not, am I going to fail? Or what is going on here? And then you get into this valley of maybe failure due to low confidence and kind of giving up. And so we hope that this gives a lesson of resilience to the founders, that they can see like, wow, actually this is normal, and this has been normalized on a global scale over thousands of founders, and this is part of the journey. This isn't sort of an ineptitude that I'm carrying. This is something I can look around and realize I'm going to be okay. And this is, I lost so much confidence from 6 months ago. That's because, you've learned a lot, and the stakes have gone higher, and it's rattling you a little bit. And this is the time to pull in help, and this is the time to dig in and kind of continue on. And
I love that you focus on normalizing it and bring in some actually a bit of a reality check. And I know that one of the incredible features of the workshops that you've both been developing over quite some time now presents these founders during the program to express some vulnerability, to actually have this experience. And I know firsthand as a facilitator, it is for me probably the single most meaningful experience that founders go through, is having this moment with other founders where there's this vulnerability and acceptance that, hey, we all have our struggles and our challenges, and it just resonates. I mean, there's never been a time when I've been facilitating that it just hasn't landed. It's always so incredible to see.
I totally agree. It's the moment where one person takes their mask down and they kind of dip their toe in, and they they put something out there, and then you just start to see all the masks come down, and this brag culture that Martin referenced. You start to see that just sort of erode away in some of these workshops, and once that happens, you can just see the growth in the room and everything. It's very, very powerful.
And I want to make sure this is a very big footnote and probably not like a head note. I think there are certain populations within the startup world that tend to suffer from this more than others.
Yes.
Women in particular, and this is backed by studies, not our data set, but external data will show that women will struggle with this more. People from underrepresented groups. If you are a minority group in the economy that you're at or in the country that you're at, chances are that you will suffer from this hidden confidence a lot more than others. And the one way that at least the data shows is the most effective way to help yourself through this is simply by understanding that this is part of the journey. So normalizing these feelings of impostership and discouragement, that's already a big part of the fix. The other thing which we talk about in the report, which I really like, is go help someone else, because there's something about getting outside of yourself and getting outside of your head and then helping maybe someone earlier in the journey of starting something up. There's something about that human action that reminds yourself that you have always something to give, despite maybe not feeling like you have anything to give. And then two, it also reminds you that you've actually gone a few steps forward. Like you've actually grown and you've learned, and there's stuff that you've achieved.
Yeah, thanks for sharing that. And actually, this is a really good jumping off point for our final question that we like to ask on the 3 Points podcast, because we've covered such incredible insights around treating people like volunteers, inviting disagreement, overcoming discouragement. And the final question for you both is, how might the world change if we implemented these points you shared with us today?
I'm motivated by, personally motivated by making the world a better place. Again, I've got some background in nonprofit. I'm trying to figure out ways to do it. I find this work that Martin and I are doing is, in my opinion, potentially so impactful. And I'm inspired by impact that we see already, and I hope a lot more in the years ahead. Ultimately, you're within the workplace. Most of us, many of us, especially folks in the startup environment, most of your waking hours are in the work environment. And that's often a place that can be inspiring, but often it can be a place that just brings about intense amount of stress, intense amount of interpersonal issues, and ultimately it can weigh you down into just living a fulfilled, happy life for yourself. And ultimately the world is a better place if folks feel fulfilled and feel in harmony with those around them. And again, most of our hours are in this environment where there's a lot of pressures and a lot of things. The stakes are high, and there's a lot of internal competition, and a lot of things are stacked against you for making this sort of a harmonious, fun, light place to exist. And so ultimately it's quite foundational. I think the impact that this could have is sincerely foundational and important.
If you were to start with the premise that most startups fail because of these people issues, and then if you were to ask, okay, thought experiment, let's say all those people issues went away, like how much more advanced would society be if these innovators who are trying to progress, our civilization are able to really achieve those impactful innovations? Where would we be as a humanity? I think fairly further along than we are today. And so a big part of what really has driven me to do this work is that we're working with the geniuses, the crazies, the people who don't let any obstacles get in their way. And if we can just give them the tools to remove all those barriers to them succeeding, I think we'll have a better world. So I'm really, this has been an incredible journey. And with Josh, with you, Tony, it's been so fun to just dive into this work and give this to the world.
Oh, I'm so energized, and it's 9 p.m. here. I don't know how I'm going to sleep tonight. Oh, it's so inspiring, and I'm really excited, to let folks know that if they do want to learn more, you two are currently working on a book. We can't say much more at this stage, but hopefully, we'll follow that. So if you're interested, folks, in kind of plugging into what Josh and Martin are doing in terms of adding value and carrying this forward into the world, make sure to check out our show notes, but definitely follow these two absolute legends on LinkedIn, and I'm sure that way you'll find out more about the work they're doing. Martin and Josh, I just want to say a huge thank you for joining us on the 3 Point podcast. It's been absolutely fantastic.
This was
Thank you
fun.
so much. Yeah, this was awesome, Tony. So good hanging out with you, and thanks for having us.